Hi everyone, my name is Nathan Thankey and I'm one of the co-coordinators for the global campaign to demand climate justice. Thank you, John, for organising this. Thanks for your scholarly efforts more generally as well. They are appreciated. Before I begin, I just want to offer a couple of caveats to what I'm about to say. We were asked to speak on what the movements can do better and how to win. And I want to begin by saying that I don't think that there's a winning formula. And I think that it might help us to maybe uh, resist being so reductive as to think that there is one. It's not a matter of x plus y equals victory. I don't think we can just add up actions and it will amount to that. I don't think it's as linear as that. And yeah, our sort of campaigning tendency to do that and to fall for sort of typical stories uh, should not blind us to the fact that those are not true. Um, I also want to note that I'm quite hesitant to apply the label youth to anything. I don't think it doesn't imply anything about a political position. Um, I'm also getting a bit older, but yeah, while I'm honored and I appreciate the ability and opportunity to speak on this virtual panel and to contribute, I also want to reject the idea that I'm in any way qualified over anybody else. I think any insight or any understanding I have gleaned in the past several years of being involved in the movements and being around them is it is thanks to others. I acknowledge that it's through many other people that they've shaped any insight I might have with their own genius, and I want to thank them. Um, so to begin with, sort of where are we now? What's the sort of state of play um, for the movements? For my sins, work largely in the UN space, so I sort of see a full range of perspectives held by those who claim to make up the climate or climate justice movement. I think climate justice has, as a term, been mainstreamed. Others might say it's been appropriated or diluted. I actually think it's a good thing that it has been mainstreamed. Not as good as climate justice, actual climate justice positions being taken up by the mainstream, but I do think it represents a progression from before. I also imagine it will cause a degree of reaction and anti-climate justice rhetoric, sort of attempt to undermine or fully appropriate what that means that we should be ready for. And that has always existed. The likes of the Mary Robinson Foundation that use climate justice in the name of their foundation, but hold inherently anti-justice views and positions because they're essentially elites who care about climate change but care more about preserving the status quo, about preserving the conditions and power relations that give rise to climate change than actually challenging them. I think that this sort of the pickup around the term climate justice will continue, as will its counteraction, because the climate crisis is deepening, is worsening, and it's accelerating. We as climate justice activist movements have been pointing that out for forever, in spite of the more "don't scare them" type of attitudes that many more liberal actors and voices would have us adopt. But it's worsening to the point that it's unavoidable. Even the mainstream can see it. I think rather than accept the logical conclusion of what the climate crisis, like where the climate crisis would lead us to, I think, which is climate justice, which is equity, which is redistribution. I think that instead of that, we're being led down a path of this tough choices, where we'll be forced into acts of what might be termed national self-interest, or we'll be forced to, through gritted teeth, accept false solutions such as the negative emissions technologies at scale and the BECCS, the carbon capture and storage with bioenergy. We've already sort of seen that after Paris. That these solutions are being pushed as necessary, given the severity of the crisis. Other things to note about our location. Post Paris, it's very difficult to know what convenes the climate justice movements. We know that it cannot simply be a sort of collection of localized keep it in the ground struggles. Um, each keep it in the ground struggle, each and every one, is absolutely necessary and important. I think adding them all up doesn't give us the transformation that we need. I do think keep it in the ground as a strategy has a sort of transformational potential. It lets us radicalize people. It lets us link out to other real life issues and struggles, which is something that we've historically struggled to do and failed to do. But it's not keep it in the ground by itself is not the whole picture. A bit more on that later. But what in terms of what convenes us, it clearly isn't the COP. Many groups have abandoned that as a fora, which is fine. But this unhelpful and ongoing dispute about whether or not it's legitimate to engage there at all, which I don't want to get into, but in short, I think it is. That has meant that clearly the COP is not the space that will convene all of us, even if for many groups it remains a space and a side of struggle. But there isn't anything else either. I don't see it in the World Social Forum. And what are the other moments that try and pull together sort of climate justice, collective planning, or even shared analysis? We don't really have that, and I think that gives rise to a problem that we have still, which is this US and maybe European centric approach to organizing and to movement building. So we have some groups setting the terms of engagement because we don't come together to find commonality and to develop collective strategy. So some groups set the terms of engagement, but those terms don't apply everywhere, and that's a problem. To move on into maybe be a bit more positive into what we need to do, although as I said, it mightn't be so reductive and so simple as to just have someone say that. If I knew what we really needed to do, why wouldn't we be doing it? I would be very surprised if I held sort of key insights there. But it's also one thing to know what we need to do and then to actually do it. What we know is that we actually need to do a lot. We need to do everything. It's Naomi Klein's this climate crisis changes everything. We also need to change everything, and the changes that are required are unprecedented. There are no market solutions. There are just no easy solutions at all. Nothing that doesn't involve major disruption to somebody. I think part of our work involves making sure that disruption is inflicted on elites rather than on the rest of us. Okay, anyway, what do we need to do? Maybe let's call them starting points. To begin with, I think we really need to get serious about addressing that dynamic that I just mentioned, that US-centric approach. I think there's consistently a dismissal of Southern voices unless they align with American activism. And so if a strategy or tactic is successful or deemed to be successful in the US, it then gets rolled out to the rest of the world. Context be damned, that doesn't work. We can't continue thinking and operating like that. We have a lot of work to do in terms of decolonizing our movements, in terms of dismantling oppression and oppressive structures and beliefs, and there are myriad practical ways we can do that, and that we can internalize an intersectional approach. And I mean this in a common sense way. I don't mean this in an ivory tower, I've perfected my call out and call in culture or whatever. It's not a purity competition. It's simply about doing the right thing and about making our movement stronger. Along those lines, I think we need to stop playing these ego politics and these NGO politics. We're all competing for a small amount of funding that comes from the same sources. That's inherently unsustainable. That's doomed. That model does not work. Throwing more and more resources into the NGO model is, I think, going to lead to more and more failure and more and more infighting. And I understand the importance of having big brands. But I see where it has led us, and I see the kind of selfish brand building that many climate and environmental NGOs engage in, and it needs to be challenged constantly from the inside and from the outside. So one thing I encourage anyone who maybe has a job as a climate activist with some group or other to really think about that, to think about, is the model that your group is operating on actually helpful, and if not, you need to change it. I think that's also maybe a bit true with the sort of climate change celebrities that we have. I do think it's a very, very good thing to recognize and to exploit the strategic potential of having very articulate and well-known spokespeople and leaders, obviously. But we sometimes fall into the trap or the error of idolizing them and then growing to resent them, maybe both in short order. I think we need to remember that movement leaders are or should be propelled into that role by the movement. In order to serve the movement, we should look for and be training leaders who understand accountability as much as they understand talking points, is what I'm trying to say. We also need to be linking out to other movements and learning from them and acting like a movement rather than a collection of NGOs. Because as I said, that I don't think that helps us. Another important point is we need to be learning how to deliver on the ground results. And by that, I don't just mean blocking things. I don't just mean keeping it in the ground. I also mean putting food on people's plates. I also mean keeping people's lights on, fighting alongside them to ensure their basic rights. And crucially, where the climate movement is concerned, helping people deal with the impacts of climate change rather than just using the stories of climate impacts to underscore our point. Actually helping people to cope. Solidarity is very important, but it doesn't mean anything by itself. We have to actually get out there. And we understand that when it comes to extraction sites, but we need to extend the idea to the sacrifice zones in the sense of where climatic impacts are being felt already. That has been done before. It's not something that has never been done. I think we can look to the examples of after Hurricane Sandy and after the Super Typhoon Haiyan, where we had movements actually doing that. I'm not saying we need to become disaster relief experts or NGOs or replace the services that should be provided by the state, but I'm saying we need to be active in supporting communities. We also should be active in supporting campaigns that might not sound like climate solutions at first, but which actually build the power of local communities to exercise their rights. And some of those campaigns just might include things like livable wages, dismantling the school to prison pipeline, and might things around universal basic income, around building unions, but essentially building and popularizing those solutions, which aren't contradictory, but aren't necessarily, oh, that's a climate solution. I think that's really important. I'm saying this. I'm an anti-accelerationist. Basically, I don't think that creating or accepting or not opposing the conditions that make people's lives worse. I think that's a terrible idea. It actually hinders our ability to affect change rather than encourage people to act. I think we're also going to have to ready ourselves for a fight after we win. That some ideas that are currently carried by what we now have as allies, or actors that we would now characterize as allies, I think will emerge to be anti-climate justice, and we would need to be ready to combat those ideas. At the present moment, we need a broad alliance of as many people as possible to put on a traditional spectrum. I think on some issues we need to have everyone sort of from everyone left of center really to be united. But after that, what? And so that after we win question, maybe getting a bit ahead of ourselves, because the other question that John pose, the other prompt is how to win. Um, I want to say that I think that it all depends on what we mean by win. We will clearly and have already clearly lost in the sense of there's massive disruption. There has been massive disruption to climate systems, massive loss of life, livelihood, and culture, which I think is atrocious. I mean, it's unacceptable. It that it will continue is also inevitable. And so I think to talk about winning when many people have lost everything it confuses me. There's no sense to it. But if indeed it is possible to win in the sense of averting the collapse of civilization, I think what we need to do is, in a nutshell, embrace paradox, and develop entirely new ways of thinking and communicating. So I'll list a couple of examples of that, but first off, I just want to say that this should be an obvious observation, but you can't win unless you contest a fight. So the whole anarcho-nihilism, deep green pessimism, or whatever it's called, I think should be swept away. There's this sort of first world phenomenon of people who maybe just want to watch the world burn and then write the poems about it and lament it, and I just think fuck them. I do think that they have a very good point embedded in some of their desires, which is that we do need space for poetry and art and space to be weird and enjoy life, and while also bearing witness to the crisis as it unfolds, and that we can't just win if we're only struggling for the sake of struggling. So I do think that is an important point we need to take on board. That we should be imagining a world which is beautiful and worth living and worth fighting for. A couple of things that are getting to the point about what I mean by embracing paradox. I think we need to be thinking constantly about the long term, about the long game, but we also need to be doing that in the context of making immediate gains. As I said, I'm anti-accelerationist. I think we actually need to make people's lives and their living conditions better in the immediate term, rather than telling them to wait until the revolution rolls around or whatever. That's an excuse and that's unacceptable. But we also need to be thinking much bigger, and for that I think we do need global solutions. And those global solutions, the closest thing that we have to them emerging, like it or not, I don't particularly like it, but it's the UN climate negotiation process. So I think writing that off as completely useless just because you don't want to go there, because after all, who does want to go there? I don't think that that's helpful. That leads me to say that we should also be idealistic and pragmatic at the same time. So there isn't a lot of time for ideological purity, and given the sort of balance of forces in the world, we need to do everything we can to avoid further fragmentation. But at the same time, we can't use the gravity of the situation that we find ourselves in to silence dissent, especially when that dissent is aimed at, or rather coming from actors that have historically had less power due to race, class, gender, ability, geography. I think there's a great Galliano quote about what is a utopia for? It's to keep us walking, and so I always take from that, it's not a destination. So be idealistic and be pragmatic at the same time. There are many hills to die on for your ideological purity, but you can only die once. So pick those battles very carefully, and let's not tear each other apart over the slightest thing. So that another point on the paradox, we need to be forgiving and be ruthless at the same time. And by that I mean relentlessly critique everything. Not just accept things blithely, but we cannot form a circular firing squad, as we need more people. We need to have a stronger movement, not a much smaller but slightly more ideologically aligned one. And I think currently there are people who are they are future movement leaders, or they are potential movement leaders who at present maybe don't act and operate they're not cultured in the way that we would like them to be, but we still need to work with them and recruit and bring them on board. And as I said earlier, if we don't try, if we don't act, we can't win. And trying usually involves failing at least once. So we can't have our critiques and our attitudes be that if you fail once, that's the end of you. Like, we cannot destroy people just for one failure. We have to learn to, yes, critique, but in a constructive way. I think we also need to begin to think outside the box completely, to think and do outside the box. The climate crisis is not a problem we have seen before. There is great wisdom to look to the past, but if you stare too long into the abyss, you know what it does? It stares back into you. So if all you're looking at is the past, you will replicate it. We have to think of things that have never been done, of bridges that have never been built, of actions that have never been taken. It is all about imagination at the end of the day. We currently have our backs to the future where we're heading into, and all we seem to be able to do is imagine what's already been. And even in that, we're restricted, right? Because we have all of human history to draw from, to draw our analogies from, and we seem to keep going back to 20th century Western European examples or North American examples. So I think expand our horizons would be a good beginning. When you look at the far right, they have really begun to do myth making of their own. We haven't started that. We're a bit stuck. So I think we need to look to the opening up of our imaginations. There's a great quote I found the other day. I can't remember who said it or wrote it. So this is completely unsighted. But it goes, as long as revolutionary struggle is conducted not on its own ground, but on the terrain of capital, there can be no significant breakthrough, no qualitative revolutionary leap. And I think extending our imaginations allows us to break new ground. It allows us to explore new terrain rather than continue to fight and lose on the current one that we're on. And so I think that's where I'll leave it, because in my head, climate justice and the fight for climate justice is as much a fight for the imagination as anything else. So we need to be asking ourselves, are we surveying and breaking that new ground? And if not, why not? What's holding us back? So I invite us all to sort of jump into the abyss or through the looking glass, whatever you want to call it, but to begin to open up our minds. I've definitely gone over time, so I'll leave it there. And I hope we have a productive discussion online over the next few weeks. Thanks once again.